Hi, my name is Alejandro Mercado, and for my Ethical Issues in Criminal Justice research project, I will be discussing ethical issues, racial profiling in law enforcement. This paper will examine racial profiling in relation to ethics, based on several studies and scholars that share various opinions and agree with various schools of thought. We will determine whether the police subculture is primarily responsible for racial profiling. In relation to ethics, we will also argue the contextualization that the police subculture affects an officer's ethical behavior as a professional. We will discuss the observation officers make and whether their decisions are unethical. We will also address whether racism is a contributing factor or an effect that is made because of the culture. So first of all, what is racial profiling? Racial profiling occurs when law enforcement or a security official, consciously or subconsciously, raises an individual to higher scrutiny because of their race, birthplace, ethnicity, or any other stereotypical scenarios associated with a certain place of origin rather than because of a specific reasonable suspicion or probable cause. Often, law enforcement primarily patrols by observation, but it has been found to create inequities by denying people of color privacy, identity, security, or control over their daily lives. In recent months and years, the climate surrounding the police and community relations has been put up to the test. The police subculture demonstrates a necessity to racially profile in order to deter crime or increase patrol in high crime areas. Many public officials and community leaders seem to disagree with that form of policing because it ultimately puts officers in a position to racially profile an individual, which in return leads to racism. Many heads of law enforcement agencies and police unions scrutinize this interference because those words are not institutionalized, although the scenarios are what lead them to those decisions whether or not it is suspicious for a black man to be walking in a predominantly white neighborhood or a white man walking in a middle-class white neighborhood at night. Officers, when making those determinations, have ethical dilemmas to think about, but often ignore in order to do their job, which is to protect and serve their community. We won't be considering police denials of racial profiling, but rather examining studies in various countries which reflect the same issue in America. We will look at how police officials term criminal profiling and the ethical dilemmas that this may cause certain officials. Officers don't take the job because they want to go out into the streets and jack up minorities, but it happens to be the circumstances that these officers face that ultimately leads them to their decision. The research. So in Canada, a very close partner of the US, with both American and French influence, in 2002, the Toronto Star conducted an often criticized study that found lots of statistical evidence of racial profiling. The study demonstrated that blacks were overrepresented in certain charge categories. They were treated more harshly in comparison to whites after they had been arrested, and were far more likely to be held in custody for bail hearings in comparison to their white counterparts. The overrepresentation displays a sense of racial profiling because of how drastically the numbers were different. You could observe that the minorities were often being targeted as the perpetrators. Parisian experience. In the Eastern Hemisphere, there are similar concerns about the way that police conduct business. You also must consider the recent activity of past terroristic events and ongoing threats to this particular part of the world. Research in Paris also found very compelling evidence, which ultimately found that, unsurprisingly, police officers overstopped in all places. Young men dressed in youth culture style, carrying no bag. The factor of carrying a bag was included in this research to destroy the excuse that they were stopping individuals because they were carrying bags that pose a threat to the public. The conclusion above dismisses that claim because in most of the scenarios, the individuals never possessed a bag of any sort. Another factor that was considered was the youth culture style of clothing, which in relation to the United States, it would be your stereotypical gangster or teenager. These factors are the same precedents that are perceived in the United States when they criminally profile. When this conclusion was presented to French media outlets, French officials did not deny such practice, and even Union officials did not dismiss the discrimination or racism could factor because the youth that were stopped were actually 2/3 minorities. French officials did not admit it was racism, but rather acknowledged that their practices can sometimes be perceived as devious methods. Now for an example in America. We will actually examine findings in one of America's largest cities, New York City. New York City has the largest population in America, and with that comes the largest police force amongst any jurisdiction. In fact, the following statistics were released by New York City itself, indicating that African American and Hispanic people are 9 times more likely to be frisked by police than Caucasians are. Another conclusion was that black people are stopped and frisked by the police more often than white youth. A very hard-hitting conclusion. The fact that the city itself released the data is particularly interesting because it could be perceived in various ways. This could have been a strategy to help community relations in the Big Apple. Now comes the ethical dilemma. So the research has allowed us to dismiss any kind of argument that racial profiling does not exist. At this point, we can all conclude that it exists without a doubt. Now the question is racial profiling an ethical issue within law enforcement? Let's examine a popular and heartbreaking case before we answer this question. On a February night in 2012, Trayvon Martin, a 17-year-old African American, was shot to death by George Zimmerman, a white neighborhood watch volunteer. Martin was walking in a predominantly white neighborhood wearing a black hoodie and holding what we know now was a bag of Skittles in his hand. We won't examine what all went on because the outcome basically led to the death of an African American at the hands of a white male. Now let me ask you this. What made him suspicious? What led Zimmerman to think he was a threat to his neighborhood safety? Finally, was Zimmerman a trained law enforcement officer? No is the answer to that question. If an individual with no training and no insight to the so-called police subculture was able to racially profile another individual, is it just an ethical issue within law enforcement? Unfortunately, it is with this turn of events that we can dismiss that only law enforcement racially profiles. Despite this case, even our government failed to pass the End Racial Profiling Act, which outlawed racial profiling in American law enforcement. Despite that, Zimmerman wasn't a law enforcement officer. This tragic case was used as an example of an unethical policing. To examine the ethics surrounding racial profiling in law enforcement, we will use 2 distinct types of scholars, deontologists and consequentialists. Deontology is defined as an ethical theory that the morality of an action should be based on whether that action itself is right or wrong under a series of rules, rather than based on the consequences of the action. In other words, is the duty and or moral obligation without considering consequences. When it comes to racial profiling, it is the duty of the officer to investigate when the situation presents itself to be suspicious, out of the ordinary, and including high crime areas. The officer uses his judgment to make contact with an individual without the backlash that the encounter might give the officer. His responsibility to the citizens he protects is to prevent crime from happening, and if he has reasonable suspicion that a black male is walking around a high crime area where lots of burglaries and robberies have been committed by black males, does he not have the duty to investigate said individual? We have looked at the above scenario from a deontologist's point of view. We will now look at the issues from a consequentialist point of view. Consequentialism is defined as the theory that ethical decisions should be made on the basis of the expected outcome or consequences of the action. In comparison to deontology, lying would be acceptable to achieve a greater good. If we were to use the same scenario above, the officer would have to become concerned about the outcome of his reason for contact. The series of questions the officer would have to be somewhere along the lines of, will I receive backlash for investigating a black person? What if he really was not doing anything wrong in the neighborhood and the individual complains? Will I get fired for racial profiling? How will the community respond in this case that the situation gets out of hand and the individual was simply walking home? These have real pertinent answers that some officers ask themselves. Most will agree that this is a very serious ethical dilemma within police departments. Departments and agencies are driving away from the deontologist standpoint to a consequentialist standpoint to help their community relations. Although the heads of agencies are trying to do away with the negative image of law enforcement by eliminating any speculation of racial profiling, where does the responsibility lie, and with whom? The ethical dilemma lies with whether the officer feels that the individual of said race appears to be suspicious or not. Let's suggest that the officer lets a suspect keep walking because he is white, and the possible suspect is black, and he just wants to avoid all of that in general. A couple of minutes later, the dispatcher describes the same possible suspect and stating that he had just committed an armed robbery with fatalities. The ethics behind it states that he made an ethical decision that now costs a life or lives. This is just one scenario. Once we start to implement a policy that condemns an ethical choice over another, will we really be helping the community be safe? The ethical issue is whether the officer precisely just jacks up an individual because of their race. Officers today will answer in most cases that they racially profile subconsciously because the individual just simply looks suspicious and perhaps the environment there simply does not help their case. The question that if racial profiling is an ethical issue in law enforcement, well, I'll leave that answer up to you. But just with one final question. Will we improve community relations at the cost of community safety?